Hello, this is Anya Leonard, founder and director of Classical Wisdom. You're listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Anthony Arthur Long. He is the Chancellor's Professor Emeritus of Classics and Irving Stone Professor of Literature Emeritus, as well as the affiliated Professor of Philosophy and Rhetoric at the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Long is often credited with spearheading the revived interest in Stoicism, as well as other ancient philosophies, and has written several books on the topic, including How to Be Free, an Ancient Guide to the Stoic Life. He has kindly agreed to speak to us today on the topic of his recent essay, Natural Catastrophe in Greek and Roman Philosophy, and what ancient philosophies can teach us in the here and now. But before we begin, a quick thank you to our Classical Wisdom Society members who make this podcast possible. If you would like to become a society member and help support the classics, please go to classicalwisdom.com and click Start Here. You can also listen to Professor Long speak live at Classical Wisdom's online inaugural Symposium, taking place October 24th to 25th. Please go to classicalwisdom.com for more details. Now, on to natural catastrophes and ancient wisdom for modern problems. You've actually been working on a book called Natural Catastrophe in Greek and Roman Philosophy. So going back to the ancient world, how did the ancients respond to natural catastrophes? How did they deal with their own pandemics?
Good. I mean, when I started this work, I wasn't thinking so much of plagues and viruses, but more things like earthquakes and tsunamis. So what the work I've done so far doesn't particularly address viruses and plagues. But, I think a lot of the conditions are similar in the sense that we're suddenly being faced with something we can't control. So your question really, just to answer it as briefly as possible, I think one wants to distinguish between the earliest ancient responses to disasters. You can go right back to the Iliad. I mean, the Iliad's our earliest Greek literature, and it actually starts with a plague. Now, the plague there has been caused by the fact that one of the great characters of the Iliad, Agamemnon, has misbehaved according to one of the gods, and so the god is punishing everybody else with a plague. But it's interesting that this great epic begins with a plague. Perhaps greatest Greek tragedy, Sophocles' King Oedipus begins with a plague. So these are examples, and you could take not just plague, you could take earthquakes. These are the ancient people, not just ancient Greeks, but people, I think, always. If you were a polytheistic society, you attributed such disasters outside human control to divine powers. Divine powers are very powerful, and we have to keep our heads down. And so I think one way of trying to cope in the ancient world before philosophy and science sort of became more important were, telling stories, telling great mythological stories about, gods and heroes. So you could have a heroic survival like Ulysses. But of course, Ulysses, the Odyssey is also full of misbehavior. I mean, Odysseus's men are very greedy. And so they come to grief through their own misbehavior. So you already have there some distinctions between natural disasters, a god's anger, but human disasters which are brought about by our own failings, as the stories tell us. So that's so mythology is a very important, I think, way of trying to cope there. And I think when we're thinking about modern ways of coping, we might want to think about the kind of stories we tell. I mean, our media, we love sex and violence on TV, but we don't have so many stories, I think, about perhaps, well, how did we come to be the species we are? And so the kind of things that, I think Freud put it so very well even before the Second World War in Civilization and Its Discontents. There's two sides to human beings. One of great, achievement and what we used to call a conquest of nature, and now it's all of a sudden coming back upon us. And I've tended to wonder whether pandemics and ecology don't come together in some way. I mean, part of my own background with the book is I'm a passionate green person. So I think that, when we talk in the present context of the pandemic about going back to normal, I say I really hope not. I mean, normal was not good, so good. Normal was going very bad, in fact. So we need to change our behavior in that way.
Yeah, we were sort of already kind of going in a very unsustainable direction, and you wonder about these disturbances. Maybe they're very helpful in a way that to make us reevaluate and readdress our situations.
I do think that exactly. So one of your first questions when we were corresponding about this was the how did the ancients cope? I think the big intellectual shifts which came with the beginnings of what we call Greek philosophy and science, and of course when I'm saying this is we're talking about a very small number of people who are being influenced by these things or doing the influencing themselves. But I mean, it is a colossal, I think, shift to suddenly start thinking, well, maybe something like an earthquake isn't caused by a god's anger. Perhaps there are actual things that we can call, forces like fire and wind, which are actually causing these things. It's not personal at all. And if we only studied things in a certain way, we could actually perhaps begin to understand them. And so the notion of understanding as a way of coping, if we can find causes of things, then things become less scary. It doesn't mean they go away. And ancient science, of course, was not technologically based. It wasn't intended to control nature. But in a certain way, I do think if you have an understanding of why something happened, you are, in a sense, helping to control it, whether it's a plague or something else. I mean, just staying away from pandemics for the moment. I mean, just to give a very interesting example, there was a terrible catastrophe that occurred, which is probably the origin of the Atlantis story in a Greek colony called Helike on the Gulf of Corinth. It was a colony, it was a city-state, completely wiped out in one day by an appalling earthquake and tsunami. And the people of Helike were, their patron god was Poseidon. So, of course, Poseidon must have been terribly angry because he's destroying the city of it, which he's the patron god. And so that goes down, I think, probably in antiquity as the greatest natural disaster. It's told by everybody right up into the Christian period. And right up into that period, people are saying we must have got, Poseidon really mad with us. But at the same time, people are explaining it in entirely naturalistic terms. So you've got competing explanations of things. And I mean, that's always going to be so, I think. But the idea that we might somehow, through human exploration and understanding, be able to find a way of dealing with things, at least emotionally, in terms of understanding, is I think that perhaps the greatest contribution ancient philosophy can have for us today.
It's interesting. You're mentioning earthquakes, and I've lived in a few different places where we've had a lot of earthquakes. And I lived in Taipei for a while, and also in Mexico City. And it's really interesting because in both places I experienced a lot of earthquakes. But they're very different cultures and very different responses, but also different technology. And in Taiwan, you had Taipei 101, which is this enormous building that's sitting right on top of a constant earthquake zone, as this huge, bold human defiance against nature. And the technology that is employed there is phenomenal. I mean, it's really amazing. But in Mexico City, I was there during the very deadly September 19th earthquake, and hundreds of people died. And there the fear of it was much more palpable because you didn't have the technology. Do you think then that because we have technology, that we think that we can handle these natural disasters, that we can live in these places, and that we won't learn from?
Well, look, I mean, we obviously are in terms of healthcare and technology, we're obviously at a huge advantage over ancient people in extraordinary ways. I mean, who would want to, ancient Rome might seem a glorious city when you read about it, but it was a stinking and, flea-ridden and virus-infected city. And so we don't want to be back there. But I do think, though, that our modern, expertise in these ways and achievements, the negative side is that we have higher expectations than are realistic. I think what's going back to the ecology thing, I think above all, what we are realizing and should be realizing is that we are using up resources at a terrible rate. So I think that in longer term, I'm more worried about the climate change than I am about the pandemic. The pandemic is devastating and awful, but it will stop. But the other thing won't stop unless we do something about it.
Yeah, and that could have even larger consequences.
Right, exactly.
To go back to the ancients, then, we have this modern technology and all this. What can ancient philosophy do to help us during this? What sort of specifics of ancient knowledge would be useful to us now?
Well, I think we're talking there, thinking more about the philosophers, and it doesn't have to be simply the Stoic philosophers. I think other philosophies that developed at the same time as Stoicism, the Epicurean philosophy, the Cynics, I think what all of these philosophies had in common was not that they developed in order to help people to cope with a particular disaster. There was a theory when I started my work that Athens' great days were over, and somehow autocracies were coming in and getting rid of democracy, and that people couldn't cope, so they needed new philosophies. Well, I think there's very little truth, I think, in that. These philosophies developed at times that were pretty good times for the people living there. So I think they weren't designed, I think, as strategies for coping. They were designed, I think, for intellectual enjoyment on its own, but also to enrich experience, for people to realize that there was a lot more to life than sort of wine, women, and song. That we have human resources that we can draw on, and know which will be very helpful in bad times, but are also available for good times. I think so it's very important. I think something perhaps modern Stoics have lost, and it's perhaps built into the modern notion of Stoicism as a philosophy of sort of resignation, perhaps even of repression of emotion, and that's really just not there in the ancient sources. Stoicism and these other philosophies are designed for all times, good times as well as bad times. So you're asking about, well, what strategies can they give us? And I think that, well, both the Greek, before the philosophers really got underway, the Greeks had a notion that's very hard to translate. Greek word for it is sophrosyne. It literally means safe thinking. It's sophro means sort of moderate, and so it's kind of a way often translated as moderation or self-control, but those are rather slightly misleading. It's really a sort of way of trying to put yourself in relation to the world in a way that you can. The world won't master you, and you won't sort of try to master the world. It's a kind of balance. It's balance. We'll call it balance. So I think if it sounds kind of perhaps not very sexy, but the notion of a balanced life. But this is, I think, an ideal which is very much there. And when the Stoics defined their good life, they just said it's living in accordance with experience of natural events. And this brings me to one of your other very good questions, I think, where you asked me whether one could really be a Stoic if you didn't have had to face some, difficult situation. And I think the Stoic answer would probably be it would be hard. It's hard to be a Stoic. In fact, nobody, I think you put it in one of your questions to me, you said, can one achieve a full understanding of Stoicism without enduring a great difficulty? Does that make catastrophe in a way necessary? And I'd like to try to respond by saying, I don't think the Stoics thought that anybody can ever achieve a full understanding of Stoicism. Stoicism is always going to be an unfinished project. The most you can hope to do is to make some kind of progress through, I mean, not technological progress, not material progress, but emotional, mental progress. The most you can try to achieve is some kind of progress through really trying to understand the world that you're living in. That's the notion of experience. The German philosopher Schopenhauer quoted the Stoics here by saying that what Stoicism is trying to achieve, and what Chrysippus meant by this, is not trying to go beyond not what's possible, that human beings exceed their situation. Now, I mean, this is why I think that Stoicism is difficult, because we must, as a species, I think, be hardwired to be optimistic. I mean, obviously human beings have had to struggle to survive as a species, and so that we're always having to make adjustments and so forth. And I think Stoicism allows for that, but it's also trying to tell us always how to be prepared for whatever's going to, you can't predict exactly what's going to happen. And so it's a matter of trying to make people ready for anything, I think. And that it's this kind of readiness of being able to adjust oneself, not giving up on all the ordinary things that one likes about family and comfort, but just realizing that these things are never just things you can take for granted.
Yeah, I like that. Many of the Stoics would suggest sleeping on the floor from time to time, or to endure hardship, so that you know that you can handle it as well, and that you will survive it, and that takes away a bit of the fear of it. And it makes me think, like, again, in Mexico, for instance, most people had a bag at the front of their door with their most valuable possessions, because they were used to sprinting out of the house when the alarm started and having 60 seconds to make it out. And that kind of regular reminder puts your life in perspective. If you're facing that fear of death on a somewhat regular basis, I mean, it changes your mindset, definitely.
Yeah. So another question, of course, you asked me, which I think this is relevant to, is you asked me about, I'm just trying to find the way you put it, was why do you think there's been a revival of Stoicism lately? And I mean, there certainly has been an enormous interest in a kind of, not to be kind of snooty, but I mean, what one might call pop Stoicism. Stoicism. There's this wonderful little book here called Stoicism Today. It's Stoicism for working mums, Stoicism for the woman in the checkout counter, Stoicism for doctors. Okay, oh, that's great. But I think all of this kind of Stoicism, which fits into a sort of a certain interest today, everybody has have their therapist, and so Stoicism as a kind of self-help thing. And I think it's great. I mean, when I started my work, nobody talked that way. Stoicism was a minor academic pursuit, and then something sort of turned around. And I don't think we quite know why. It must have something to do with the zeitgeist, in some things, there are all kinds of explanations of why things happen, which may not be the way they, certainly somebody read a book and somebody else talked to somebody else, and so it happened. Anyway, take it. But I think if there's something missing in this sort of modern Stoicism, I think it's the social dimension of Stoicism. Even if you take the ancient Stoics, one of them is let's say Marcus Aurelius was a Stoic. Well, he's doing a big social job. He's an emperor, Epictetus is a teacher, and Seneca, who'd been involved in Neronian politics in a very big way and then got fired. I mean, when he writes his letter, I mean, he puts his Stoicism into letters to a friend. So there's always a social dimension to Stoicism. It's not something I mean, although Marcus Aurelius, he wrote what this word he called to himself, and I think that may have given him a somewhat misconception of Stoicism as a sort of something to do on your own and just a kind of meditative practice. You can use it that way, of course. But I think, Stoicism is really a social philosophy. It's intended, I mean, Stoics thought that we all have these instincts to try to live together in a contented way. So I think that what's perhaps missing in a lot of the modern way of Stoicism is this is the idea of how we can use Stoicism in a kind of community way, in a communal way. And I mean, all the cliches about today about how we're not, when politicians are not focused on the common good and all that. Well, what I think is lying behind that is something about modern materialist culture where, I'm not talking about people going wrong, but politicians seeing their role as simply trying to, satisfy economic satisfactions rather than getting into the question of, well, what really helps people to feel, fulfilled and contented, because when we then get into issues to do with education as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because you think of Epicureanism, and that definitely had a social element. I mean, historically, you think of the communes and such like that. And that one, I think people can see the social element in that philosophy a lot more. Whereas, yeah, you're right. Modern Stoicism is sort of like a self-help. Here's your writing journal, make your notes every day.
Absolutely, yes. Nothing wrong with that, of course. I mean, and any good philosophy which has a kind of psychological foundation, as Stoicism does have, it's going to have to adapt to different situations. So I don't want to criticize that. I'm simply saying that there's a dimension I think that perhaps some people may be missing, which Stoicism can help you to help if you are thinking in terms of social norms.
Well, I think we should definitely throw a large Stoics party, maybe when all of this is over, a Stoics ball or something. We can really bring the social element back into it. I would love to do that. Thank you for listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks. Classical Wisdom Society members can listen to the entire podcast with Professor Long at classicalwisdom.com. If you would like to learn more about Professor Long's books, including How to Be Free, An Ancient Guide to the Stoic Life, you can purchase them all on Amazon.com.